Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. We've been following a theme through John's Gospel, the theme of replacement or fulfillment, that Jesus comes along and replaces or fulfills things out of the Old Testament. That theme continues today with John chapter 6. The first part of the chapter is a very familiar section to you, I'm sure. Jesus is out on the hillside. He's talking to this multitude, 5,000 people, and suddenly occurs to everybody that there's no food there. And Jesus says to Philip, hey, how are we going to feed these people? This, we're told in verse 6 of chapter 6, he said to test him, for he knew himself what he would do. Philip says, 200 denarii. 200 denarii. Denarii is a day's labor, common laborer's day's wages. So basically, almost a year's worth of wages wouldn't feed all these people. Andrew, who's always finding somebody and bringing them to Jesus. 3 different times in John's Gospel, he finds somebody and brings them to Jesus. And this time, he finds a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, that's pretty gutsy. You got 5,000 people sitting out there, and Andrew shows up in front of Jesus with somebody's sack lunch and says, here we go. And Jesus takes it, and you know the rest of the story. He feeds 5,000 people with that boy's sack lunch. The story continues. The people in verse 15, the people want to make him king. Hey, if this guy can feed 5,000 people with a sack lunch, little boy's sack lunch, that'd be a pretty good king to have around. Jesus has to retreat from that. We've got the story of him walking on the water, but where I want to pick it up is verse 25 of chapter 6. What all this means and how the replacement theme comes into here. In chapter 25, when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Jesus answered them, truly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. You had enough to eat, so you come looking for me. Skip on down to verse 28, where the disciples ask him, what must we do to be doing the works of God? Jesus answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. So they said to him, then what sign do you do that we may see and believe in you? What work do you perform? So what's the miracle? What's the thing here that's going to convince us? And then they give him a hint. Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. A key understanding here is that some of the rabbis taught that when Messiah came back, the manna would start up again. You remember the manna fed these people through 40 years in the wilderness. It was there 6 mornings a week. They picked it up. They ate manna daily, and it kept them alive. And the rabbis said when Messiah comes, some of the rabbis said, when Messiah comes, God will start that manna up again. So their question is probably associated with that rabbinical teaching, and they are asking, okay, where's the manna? If you're the Messiah, where's the manna? Now, ironically, they just ate bread on the hillside, 5,000 people fed from a sack lunch. But Jesus answered in verse 32, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven. My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. And then in 35, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Jesus himself replaces that concept of the manna coming again. Jesus is the new manna that God gives, the new life-giving force, the life-giving sustenance that God gives to his people. He replaces the manna in the Old Testament. By the way, when he says, I am the bread of life in verse 35, that's the first I am in John's Gospel. You could probably guess how many I ams there are going to be in John's Gospel. I'll spoil it for you. There's 7. We'll count them as we go. The conversation goes on as he continues to talk about himself being that bread from heaven. It gets a little more testy as they get to the end of the chapter. In verse 56, Jesus said, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me and I in him. And you can almost see the people going, ew, what is he talking about? And he says in 57, as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who eats me will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not such as the fathers ate and died. He who eats this bread will live forever. And he's talking about himself. He's talking about people taking himself into themselves. As you might suspect, verse 60 says, many of his disciples, when they heard it, said, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples murmured at it, said to them, do you take offense at this? And he goes on a little bit. Verse 66, after this, many of his disciples drew back and no longer went about with him. So he loses some disciples, not the 12, but some other followers. Jesus said to the 12, will you go away? And I love Peter's answer. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. In the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three that have a parallel storyline, Peter's confession comes at Caesarea Philippi. In John's Gospel, this sounds like Peter's confession. Where would we go? You are the Holy One of God. We'll stick with you. Jesus does feed his people. He feeds his people on the Word. He feeds his people on himself. He feeds his people through his suffering and death and resurrection and makes us his. Jesus replaces that old manna expectation and becomes the life-giving force for all of us.